Today we are talking to Dr. Michael Huemer, professor of philosophy at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Professor Huemer holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of California at Berkeley, his PhD from Rutgers University. He's the author of 4 books, most recently, The Problem of Political Authority, an examination of the right to coerce and the duty to obey. This book is going to blow your mind. It is my pleasure to welcome to the program right now, Michael Huemer. Michael Huemer, thanks for spending some time with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Before we get into the details of your arguments in the different chapters, I want you to take a minute to explain to the audience the overall project that you're engaged in and how you go about it.
There's this question about the nature of political authority, and political authority is a kind of hypothetical moral property that the state allegedly has, where it gives it a kind of different moral status from all other agents. Political authority is supposed to explain why it's permissible for the state to do all kinds of things that are not permissible for any other agent. So if I have a charity that I want to collect money for, it's not considered permissible for me to collect it by force. I can't go out and extort people and, threaten to imprison people if they don't contribute to my charity, even if it's a really good charity. But the state is allowed to do that. And so there's a philosophical question of why they should be allowed to do that and nobody else is. So a theory of authority is supposed to explain things like that. At the same time, it's supposed to explain why we should obey the state when we wouldn't have to obey anyone else. If somebody else tells you, don't take these drugs because they're bad for you, it's generally thought that you don't have to obey them. But most people think that you have to obey the state when they tell you not to take certain drugs.
These are arguments that, to a lay audience, will sound familiar because they are objections that, on a lower level, the average libertarian encounters all the time, on Facebook, with friends and family. And the way you would boil it down, and the way you would see it in sort of ordinary conversation would be, look, you obviously benefit from the state, and if you didn't like it here, you might as well leave. But the fact that you're here and you're enjoying the benefits indicates that you have implicitly or tacitly consented. So we're all familiar with this sort of argument. And it always struck me that this is one of the weakest arguments I think I've ever heard on behalf of anything, and yet it has such purchase on the public mind. How do you respond to it?
Let's say that the mafia has taken control of your neighborhood, right, and they're extorting money from you. And you say to the mafia boss, please stop extorting money from me. This is wrong. And the mafia says, well, you live in this neighborhood. We control the neighborhood, and you live here, so you're agreeing to have us extort money from you, right? Well, if the mafia, if somebody actually owns the neighborhood legitimately, right, like they had acquired a property right by one of the accepted legitimate methods, and then they said, if you move in here, then you have to agree to this, and then you sign the contract that moved in. Then they have an argument that they can do whatever the contract said they could do. What you can't do is go to somebody who's living on their own property, which they own, and tell them that they have to move out of their property if they don't agree to your terms. You don't have the right to just set terms on other people's use of their own property, right?
Now, you're also talking in the book about a sort of hypothetical social contract. Can you talk about that a little bit?
After philosophers figure out that there's no actual social contract, nobody actually agreed to it, then they move to, well, maybe you would have agreed to it in some hypothetical scenario, right?
Right.
It's a little hard to see how that's supposed to give any moral force. Here's an example. Let's say you're a doctor in a hospital and an accident victim has just been brought in. The accident victim needs immediate medical care. However, he is unconscious. Now, normally you need somebody's consent in order to give them medical care, but you can't get this person's consent. So what do? The answer is, well, you give them the medical care anyway. And the rationale for this is, well, it's reasonable to assume that they would consent if they were able. All right, so there's the efficacy of hypothetical consent. But this isn't going to work for the state and the social contract. It's not going to work for the state to say, well, you would have consented. In the case of the unconscious accident victim, it's actually important that the victim is unconscious. If the victim is conscious, then you have to ask them. You can't just say, well, you would have consented if I had asked you, right? Citizens of modern governments are not all unconscious. The government could ask them if they consent. The government chooses not to ask them because they're afraid of what the response would be.
Yeah, there you go.
If the consequence of your saying, no, I don't agree, would be that you would have zero tax liability, then quite a lot of people would say, no, I don't agree. The other problem with the hypothetical consent theories is that when the philosopher argues that you would consent, they do that with a counterfactual assumption that your beliefs and values were different from what they actually are. Because there are certain people, like most libertarians, who would not consent, or at least would not consent if they knew what the government was going to be like. So, in order to make the argument that hypothetically we would consent to the state, you have to either ignore the libertarians or hypothetically assume that the libertarians had different beliefs than what they actually had. The mere fact that a larger number of people wants to do something than the number who are opposed to it doesn't mean that they have the right to do it. So if there's some behavior that would normally violate somebody's rights, it doesn't cease to be a rights violation just because more people support it than oppose it. For example, I go out for drinks with some of my friends, and we run up a big tab. The question arises as to who's going to pay for it. And suppose that a majority of my friends vote that I should pay for everyone, and I'm the only one who disagrees. If 5 people want me to pay for everyone, only I don't want to pay for everyone.
Right.
Am I obligated to pay for everyone? Are they ethically entitled to force me to pay for them? No. So it's really unclear how the appeal to the opinion of the majority makes any difference. It could be just a few dollars and they still don't have the right to take my money. So it looks like majority will has very little moral force.